It's so wonderful to see you all here this afternoon. Thanks for making it to the 5th Annual Sandra J. Skolnik Lecture. We're going to go ahead on the theory that we don't punish the prompt. This is our 5th Annual Sandra J. Skolnik Lecture. It's a unique event that brings distinguished and internationally known speakers to Maryland. People who are known for their work that has contributed to public policy in the field of early care and education. I want to insert here a big thank you to the Maryland Family Network staff who works really hard for months to bring this about, especially Doug Lent and Warren Jones, Steve Rohde, Clinton McSherry, Kathy Zavodovich, and the many people you saw at the registration desk and all the way up into this room. We always work as a team, and there's nothing like a big event like this to bring that out. This lecture series, as many of you know, has been named for Sandra J. Skolnik, who was a visionary leader and a champion for young children in Maryland for many years. Over her 30-year tenure at the Maryland Committee for Children, she built the organization into a driving force for accessible, affordable child care. Sandy pioneered the development of the Maryland Child Care Resource Network, which has 13 locations statewide, including Maryland Family Network. It continues to provide child care resource and referral services to Maryland's families and training and technical assistance to child care providers. She developed the organization's capacity to undertake highly effective public policy advocacy that has contributed to Maryland's standing as one of the best states in the nation for child care and our early childhood infrastructure and regulation. She advanced early childhood mental health services and assessment system for school readiness and laid the plans for universal access to public pre-K. Still a work in progress. She's been recognized as a leader at local, state, and national levels. She was a founder of Friends of the Family, the first board chair of the Maryland Association of Nonprofit Organizations, and Sandy served as a member of the board of directors of the National Association of Child Care Resource and Referral Agencies, now known as Child Care Aware. Most importantly, Sandy inspired us, her colleagues, and her friends to care more and work harder for young children. I know she would be pleased with the progress that's been made in Maryland, and she'd be first to tell us that there's much more to do. Her work lives on through our work at Maryland Family Network and through each of you who strives to make sure we live in a world where children and their families have the resources to succeed. We celebrate here the memory of Sandy Skolnik. And just in perfect time, I want to welcome one of Sandy's very best, closest, and longest friends, Senator Barbara Hoffman. So glad to see you, Senator. Guess while I'm acknowledging people, I should say that there are 3 board members of Maryland Family Network here tonight, Jackie Lampel, Vicki Finkelstein, and Mary Gunning. So thanks for joining us. In our field, we all know this is something our speaker and I were talking about before we got here tonight. Early childhood is all about relationships, starting first with the attachment of parents and child. And one of the people in Baltimore who I think is one of the most capable builder of relationships I have ever seen is Mr. Bob Blum, who represents Bloomberg School of Public Health here tonight, our host and friend and colleague of ours for many, many years. Bob has an astonishing capacity to support people, his students, his colleagues, his friends, his peers, his bosses, his funders. We all adore Bob, and he has really helped advance the field of public health, especially as it relates to adolescent parents and very young children here. He is the chair of the Department of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and is the organizer of the Community University Coordinating Council, which is an extraordinary group of people from the greater Baltimore community and the Hopkins community working together to find synergies of all kinds among members of the greater Baltimore area. And he's really advanced, I think, the cause of Hopkins as a force for good in Baltimore. So we greatly appreciate, Dr. Blum, everything you've done for Maryland Family Network and for little kids, including sponsoring this lecture series every year. So I'm going to ask Dr. Blum to come up and introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Oh my God, well that really says everything I wanted to say. Thank you. That was absolutely lovely. But I think there probably isn't a person in this room, Margaret, who doesn't know your capacity for inclusion, your capacity for joy, your capacity to advocate and to build relationships at every step along the way. And you really do carry the torch that Sandy Skolnik really ignited for Maryland. So I think before we turn to today's speaker, I would like to applaud you. I will introduce today's speaker two ways. I'll share a little bit of her work and a little bit of her. Her work, Dr. Martha, Professor Martha Erickson, is, as you can see, the Director Emerita of the Irving B. Harris training programs at the University of Minnesota. She was the founding director of the Consortium on Children, Youth, and Families. The Consortium on Children, Youth, and Families is itself an exceptional entity. It really represented the commitment of the entire university, from the president and the provost on down, that children, youth, and families should be central to the mission of our university at the University of Minnesota, and it should be central to the land grant efforts that constitute many of our largest universities in the United States. Marty took on the leadership role, and I had the joy and opportunity to be part of that board for much of the time. I came to Baltimore 10 years ago from the University of Minnesota. I also was officed next to Marti Erickson. Her suite was over here, mine was over here. And so not only did I sit on the board, but we had endless opportunities to talk and to collaborate. And as gracious as you were, Margaret, in what you said of me, Marti Erickson was the preeminent bridge builder. She was the person who said, here's an idea, and I'd like you and you to get together, or bring 3 or 4 of us together around an idea that would benefit kids. Didn't always ignite, but more often than not it did. And without ever trying, it never would have. So she has that extraordinary capacity. She also has an extraordinary capacity as a translator. She was a researcher and understands developmental psychology from an academic perspective. But she has translated that perspective to advance the health and well-being of young children and moms. And that's reflected in the program and blog, Mom Enough, that she and her daughter Erin co-host. So over the years that we shared common space, we also developed a common friendship. And Marti Erickson and her husband Ron became very dear friends of mine and my wife Michael. Beyond that, her daughter Erin is someone who's very special to me because, among other things, she reached out. Was she a high school student? As a high school student, she reached out and said, I'd like to spend some time with you. And we set up an internship program for her. And this was a young woman who had the spark of her mother, and I am sure still has the spark of her mother, and a passion for education, a passion for young children. And to have been able to see her evolve was a particular pleasure. So Marti, I couldn't be more pleased, as I know Michael is, as I know we all are, that you are here today. Thank you so much.
This feels like homecoming, I tell you. Thank you so much, Bob, for that beautiful introduction. And it's just such an honor to be here and such a thrill to connect with dear friends like Bob and his wife, Michael, and to get to know new friends, Margaret and Doug Lent, who has been very instrumental in my arrangements here, and others who I've met. I have never seen a welcoming committee like all of you beautiful women who were all along the stairway as I came in. I thought, wow, if every speaking engagement were like that, I'd just be flying. You know, it's really so nice to feel such a warm welcome. And certainly it is such an honor to be able to speak at an event that is named in honor of Sandra Skolnik. It's just awe-inspiring, really, to read about Sandra's work and to learn about all that she inspired, all that she, with all of you, accomplished. And so I feel humbled by standing on her shoulders today as I bring you some of my thoughts about where we are in early childhood care and education and where we still need to go. And as Margaret said in her lovely opening remarks, we still have a lot of work before us. I think we all know that. But before we zero in on that, I think it's really important just to revisit some of the things that we have accomplished. Maybe not in full, perhaps none of these things are fully accomplished yet, but just to identify those things and really give yourselves a pat on the back for what you have done. And then since I was invited to talk to you, I get the luxury and the privilege of giving you my 2 cents worth about some of the things that I think are really important for us to reflect on at this point in this crusade for young children and their families. And so I've really thought a lot about where we've been and where I hope we're going. And I've come with a couple of major areas of emphasis for my talk. And I hope that it won't feel too disjointed to you. There are 2 areas that you might not automatically think of putting together. But I think both of those areas of research really do have a lot to do with the essence of children, with what a child is and what really allows a child to thrive and succeed in life, with joy, with satisfaction, with wonderful connections like those we've been celebrating here among ourselves. So that's where I'll go in the time allotted to me, and I'll leave some time for questions. I also want to say in advance that I have this ridiculous fear as a speaker, and I've been speaking for decades to the point where sometimes I'm tired of hearing myself talk. But no matter how much speaking experience I have, I always have a fear that I'm going to run out of things to say. And so I always come with more slides than I need. So don't panic if you see that I'm kind of flying through some of those things, or if it seems like I'm not going to get through all of it. I did provide handouts of my PowerPoint for you. If they're not self-explanatory, if I don't get to every little detail, you can email me at momenough.com, which is where my daughter and I do our weekly parenting audio show and a number of other resources. You can always reach me there and ask for more information, and I'll do my best to send it to you or to respond personally to an email. So, remembering and honoring Sandra Skolnik. Let's think back to when Sandra Skolnik began her advocacy on behalf of Maryland's children in the early 1970s, as I understand it. How far have we come, and what are we doing right? There are a number of things that I could mention here, but I think first and foremost, I want to name what has really changed in the very ethos of our society. And my career path kind of parallels in time that of Sandra Skolnik. I actually started working in the field in 1967 when I first graduated from college. Got my undergraduate degree, went back soon, got a master's, and then later, after having 2 kids and working for about 10 years, went back for a PhD, and have been mucking around in this broad area of children and families for a very long time. And one of the most heartening things to me in that time is to see how people beyond the usual suspects have begun to really take hold of this issue, particularly business leaders, people from all sectors of the business world. Now, certainly where I live in Minnesota, we have some major business leaders who absolutely are leading the crusade for young children. And I think a couple of things have really helped to fuel that, in addition to lots of blood, sweat, and tears on the part of advocates like you. But one thing is that brain science has really given us some hard evidence that's a little different from what people often think of as the softer evidence that comes from psychology. Now, I'm a developmental psychologist by background, and I wish that psychological consequences alone held more stock with people outside of our own circles. But the reality is that new brain imaging, or relatively new, and tests of cortisol levels in children's saliva, and looking at how that affects different aspects of both their behavior and also what's visible in their brains, has really given us a hard data so that people who do care about science, at least, and woefully, there are too many people in our nation today who don't care about science, but those who do and who understand the importance of evidence-based information to guide us in practice and policy are really influenced by that harder science. And I'll touch on some of those aspects of hard science as it relates to one of the big topics I'm going to address in a few minutes. A second thing that has happened, and it relates and builds on the new brain science, I think, is that people in the field of economics have grabbed onto this. I'm sure most of you are familiar with James Heckman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for calculating the return on investment when we invest in early childhood programs. A good friend and colleague of mine is Dr. Art Rolnick, who was the Vice President for Research at the Federal Reserve in Minneapolis. He now is a fellow at the Humphrey Policy Institute at the University of Minnesota, where I spent most of my career. And he is on the circuit speaking and writing about the importance of investing in young children. So we have a ready workforce, so we have a strong, healthy society. He's really bringing our youngest children into discussions of educational disparities and the achievement gap and all sorts of other things that affect our society. So I think that's something that has really been a very major accomplishment. I won't dwell as much on some of these other points because this one is so foundational and I think has facilitated these other more specific kinds of achievements. So what else are we doing right? And again, these are not finished by any means, but we have at least begun to generate a movement toward preschool for all that's accessible and affordable. We have a long way to go before that's a reality, but at least we have a lot of people from across different sectors and even different points on the political spectrum who are behind the idea that this could really make a difference. Second, and I know this was something that Sandra Skolnik devoted most, if not much, if not most of her career to, is improving child care quality, both through quality rating systems, through training and ongoing monitoring, through just raising up the whole idea of how crucial it is that our youngest children are in the hands of people who really understand children and give them not only safety and good babysitting, as many people used to think of childcare, but really provide the kinds of learning environments, supportive social and emotional environments that allow children to thrive. We have universal early childhood screening now. Back when I was starting out, we had no early childhood special education. We certainly were not really doing screening on behavior and different aspects of children's development. That screening is identifying thousands, maybe millions of children who are either at risk of developmental difficulties or have identifiable disabilities so that they can get the help they need as early as possible. And from a wealth of research now, we know that the earlier the better. In fact, things that were back in my early career, children with Down syndrome were institutionalized at a certain age, and they plateaued in their development at about 5 or 6 years of age in many cases. I remember going out and doing psychoeducational assessments on kids with Down syndrome in state institutions, and that would not happen today. Now we have these kids getting early intervention, and they're not plateauing into, maybe they're never plateauing, they're continuing to learn and develop right on up through their growing up years, and many of them living very productive and quite self-sufficient lives in many cases. Granted with supports, but we all need support. So that's just one of many examples. Along with the screening, of course, we do have now early intervention services for children with special needs or children who are at risk. Again, those services are often not funded up to scale. We have mandates without appropriate funding, so we still have a lot of work to do there, but we've made extraordinary progress. We also have extension and expansion of long-standing family-focused programs going back to the War on Poverty in the 1960s, Head Start and Early Head Start, with some really exciting improvements and enhancements of those services, along with many new kinds of services that have built on that legacy. And we have collaborations that cut across many, many sectors of our community, not only among the usual suspects again, but with libraries, with park systems, certainly with children's museums. You have that magnificent children's museum here in Baltimore. I've worked with that National Association of Children's Museums, and they're doing extraordinary work around young children, and often working in great partnerships within the local communities as well as nationally. Healthcare providers and nonprofits, and also the corporate world. So huge things that we can congratulate each other and ourselves on and really recognize our progress. Kudos to all of you who have helped to make that possible. But work to be done. In recent years, we've seen a real explosion of new research that has illuminated some of the most important factors, the most crucial, critical factors in early child development. And so I think this is a very important time to reflect, to pause, and to look at how well our current policies match what we know children need. And when I do this, I conclude that we really have some big room for improvement. I'll be curious to hear your comments and questions later to hear what you think. But let's take a look at what I think we really need to be honing in on more. Let's consider, first of all, the babies being born here in your state of Maryland this year. What does research say those babies need while they're still babies, before they're even a year old, before they're even 6 months old, that they will need in order to thrive and succeed? And then let's consider what's the gap between what we know and what we do about this. I'm going to focus, as I mentioned before, on 2 broad areas of research, each of which has very strong implications for early childhood policy and practice, and each of which, I think, even though we sometimes give lip service to them, our policies and practices really don't say that we are taking them as seriously as we need to. The first, and you may not be surprised by this given that my background is largely as an attachment researcher at the University of Minnesota, but we now have a wealth of research going back to the 1960s, the theories being set forth long before that even. Children need the foundation of a secure attachment with at least one caring adult. Although parents are not the only adults who matter, parents are first and foremost when it comes to children and to attachment. Other attachments, grandparents, Blums and I are excited grandparents. I know we love to think that we're very important attachment figures to those grandchildren. I know I am, but I also know I don't supplant my daughter and my grandchildren's father, or my son and his wife. And so parents really come first. And the meaning that people make as they get older of the kind of relationship they have with their parent adds another layer of meaning to that. So it isn't just the relationship that develops. Whoops, this is going by itself. Has a life of its own there. So it's the meaning that children make as they get older and reflect on that relationship. It says a lot to a child if this is just going by itself, if he or she doesn't get that kind of care and that kind of connection that's needed for good health and well-being. And so there's a layer of added impact that comes when we look at what we got from those parents who were supposed to be the safeguards in our lives, our secure bases and our place of refuge, our safe haven, the people who guide and teach us and protect us. So what shapes the quality of attachment? We know that attachment develops primarily in the first year, year and a half of life, and we can't measure it reliably until late in the first year of life, because it's not something that happens in the hours or days right after a baby is born, what we used to refer to, sometimes still do refer to as bonding. It's a gradually developing relationship that is made up of repeated interactions between parent and child, so that gradually that child knows what to expect and adapts to what to expect, adapts to the care that that child is receiving. And then we see a little dance evolving and kind of settling into a predictable pattern between parent and child, or another caregiver and child. And what leads to what we would hope for every child, what we call a secure attachment, because virtually just about every child is going to become attached. It's in our species. We're powerfully predisposed to form attachments, but they're not all secure. They don't all give us that solid platform for later development. And so what predicts that the attachment will be of a quality that really gives that child a leg up? And the first and foremost, from countless studies done around the world with different cultures, different geographic locations, different socioeconomic groups, this is pretty darn universal. The parent's predictable and sensitive responses to the child's cues and signals. Long before a child has words, that little baby is telling us all sorts of things with cry, with a facial expression, with outstretched arms, with turning away and saying, I don't really want to be tickled right now, or hugged, or kissed, I need some space. All those cues that babies give us. And it's when parents read those cues, try to figure out what that cue means, and respond accordingly, that the child begins to develop trust. I can count on this person to give me what I need. And not just trust in that person, but trust in self. Because a little baby is not just lying there passively waiting for a parent to figure out what's needed. That baby is making a statement. And when it works, when it brings that parent or other caregiver with the response that that child was hoping for or needing, then that teaches the child, I have some power in my world. It's what we developmental psychologists talk about as a sense of effectance. We can have an effect in the world, and that's huge to human development. So it's trust and security in other and belief in self. Along with that sensitive, predictable response is that the parents also understand and accept the child's needs for comfort and closeness. Now that seems so obvious. What parent wouldn't understand that? Well, the spoiling myth is alive and well in many quarters. You pick that baby up, he's going to be so spoiled, or he's going to be a mama's boy, he's going to be a wimp or a wuss. You ever heard that? Yeah. And yet little boys and little girls both need that comfort and closeness. No child can be strong and independent without first having that cushion of dependence. And not all parents, not all people begin to understand that. So that's the underlying belief and knowledge that those sensitive, predictable responses are grounded in. And along with that is the parent's encouragement of the child's exploration and autonomy, emerging autonomy as the child gets older, while still being that secure base. I'm going to be right here when you need me. I'm going to keep an eye on you, but I'm going to let you go do your thing. Because attachment is not just about being glued together. It's about both holding on and letting go. And aren't those the two giant issues in human development? They play out again in spades in adolescence, in a much more sophisticated arena, but it's those same basic issues that come up in the first 1 to 2 years of a child's life. And those are the things that shape the quality of attachment. If a parent's just holding on to that child because it feels so darn good to cuddle them all the time, maybe a parent's lonely and doesn't get enough contact from somebody else. And, I get that. I just want to smother my grandkids with kisses and hugs every day. But they let me know sometimes that's not okay. I remember my daughter, when she was 2, said to me one morning, she put her hands on my face and she said, "I've got an idea. Let's not have any hugs and kisses all day." She's still sassy and has the spark that you saw when she was in high school. So it's a matter of really allowing that child to be his or her self and not just using the child to meet our own needs. Doesn't mean it's a bad thing to want to smother them with hugs and kisses. And if they're up for it, go for it. But respecting them as individuals. I'm awake. I wonder what woke me up. Now I'm going to have a terrible time getting back to sleep. I hate waking up in the middle of the night. I start to imagine all kinds of bad things. Like, what if mommy and daddy stop loving me? And what if they suddenly move out in the middle of the night? Well, there's only one way to find out for sure. Wah. Good, now I can go back to sleep. I love how cartoons can just cut through all the research talk and just capture those basic things. This is what attachment is all about. You're not going to spoil that baby. In fact, the attachment research shows that if you respond consistently and predictably, especially to their calls for comfort, that child is going to cry less by the end of the first year of life, is going to be more autonomous in a healthy way as a toddler and a preschooler, and more predisposed to be cooperative, to follow the guidance and directions of that attachment figure. And that comes from a lot of research, but also from a landmark longitudinal study that I had the good fortune to work on for many years during my career at the University of Minnesota, the Minnesota Parent-Child Interaction Project. We followed 267 women from when they were pregnant with their first child, followed their babies from the moment they were born, and that study is still going on, started in 1975, so those babies now are 38, 39 years old, and we're seeing the next generation and what's happening in terms of intergenerational cycles of parenting and all sorts of aspects of development. So those are things that come from our own studies as well as those of others around the US and around the world. So how does attachment shape a child's lifelong development? Well, in several ways. First of all, and perhaps the most fundamental, is that secure base of this trusted caregiver becomes a springboard for exploration and learning. It fuels motivation, it fuels confidence. And looking prospectively in our longitudinal research, we really see that, how the kids who had that secure foundation, all of our families were generally high risk, They were living with poverty. Many of them had a history of abuse. Many of them were young and had very inadequate resources to be beginning their journey as a parent. Lots of risk factors. But even in those risk factors, that secure base became a springboard for those children going on and being motivated and engaged and confident, eager to learn. The comfort and protection that is a part of attachment has been shown to affect self-regulation. I'm assuming most of you in this room know what that means, but it's just how we handle our emotions when we get worked up. How do we manage to get calmed down and reorganize and refocus if we're angry or we're sad or we're frustrated or whatever our feelings might be? How do we manage those emotions? And we learn that when someone else manages those emotions for us initially, when someone gently calms us down and then gradually begins to let us calm ourselves down sometimes. So self-regulation is one of the most striking outcomes of a secure attachment. Attachment is also very much about love. You know, I spoke about attachment for many years and didn't really talk about love. And in the 1990s, I had the great good fortune to get involved at the invitation of Vice President Gore in a long-term family policy initiative called Family Reunion. It was a nonpartisan initiative that brought together the best thinkers every year around a set of family policy issues related to a theme of the year. And so I spent a lot of time going to the White House, sitting in the West Wing in Vice President Gore's office, or going to the old executive office building and sitting there with the Vice President and his Chief of Staff, and very often Tipper Gore and her Chief of Staff, and the top thinkers that the Vice President would ask us to bring in. And he would specifically say, bring people who disagree with me. Don't bring the choir. Bring people who have different policy ideas, but who are grounded in research and solid knowledge. And it was the richest intellectual experience I think I've ever had in my life. Went on for 8 years and was just extraordinary. But one of those meetings, we were sitting there talking about attachment and about what it means in terms of how we reach out to parents, how we support parents in their most important role. And Tipper just very quietly said, you know, I notice that whenever we talk about attachment, nobody says the word love. And I thought, well, my gosh, you know, I'd never stopped to think about that. But love is so much at the center of attachment. And so that parent and that baby are falling in love with each other. And you just see it when you watch good, healthy parent-child interaction, grandparent-child interaction. They're falling in love, and it's the love that that child feels for that parent or that other caregiver that makes that child want to please that person. Now, does that mean they're not going to go through the terrible twos? No, that's an important developmental task. Doesn't mean they're going to be, you know, perfect little child all the time, but they are going to want to maintain that connection. And so not surprisingly, we see a very strong connection, a very strong predictive relationship between secure attachment and how that child cooperates, not only with that attachment figure, but then that tends to generalize to others. The child is predisposed to cooperate with other caring adults. That helps in school, in childcare, in life in general. And along with that, when you experience empathy, as a child with a secure attachment has, then you develop the capacity to be empathetic toward others. So a very strong link between attachment and empathy, between love and empathy, I would say. And finally, trust. Attachment's all about trust, and that leads to greater openness as it generalizes out from this strong attachment relationship, openness to positive, respectful connection to other adults and also to peers. So when we follow these kids long term, we see a very, very strong link between quality of attachment when these kids were 1 year of age and how they are interacting with their peers and with other adults. There's been a book written that pulls together a lot of the findings from the particular longitudinal study I referred to. It's very complex research, but it comes down pretty wholeheartedly on the side of what attachment does as a foundation in human development. One other very important thing about attachment. When a child has a secure attachment, that relationship becomes a buffer against stressful experiences. Now, that doesn't mean that children with a secure attachment don't experience stress. What it means is that all children, all human beings, encounter stressful situations. And let's say it's a medical procedure, just as one example. Let's say a child has to have an invasive, painful, or at least unpleasant medical procedure. If that child has a secure attachment and that attachment figure is there, that child produces less cortisol, the stress hormone that we all produce when we're under stress. And the child is behaviorally able to calm down more quickly and kind of reorganize and go back to life as it was after that stressful experience. My good friend and colleague at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Megan Gunner, is one of the foremost neuroscientists studying stress. And what she says is that in the absence of a secure attachment, repeated or significant stressful experiences produce toxic stress. And she's talking literally in a chemical way. Too much cholesterol, remaining at high levels for too long. There are other chemicals and other things going on, but cortisol is the one most often studied, and it's very easy to access through the saliva. Very simple little procedure, just a cotton swab in the child's mouth, and you can tell how the stress, how the cortisol is rising and falling. So attachment is a very powerful and important buffer against stressful life experiences. And she and other researchers have looked at many things beyond the medical procedure example I gave. They've even looked at the loss of a parent through death, all sorts of things that are hugely traumatic, really an enormous loss for any child, but how the child recovers and copes and carries on is mediated in powerful ways by whether that child has a secure attachment. So how does it look when a child is not securely attached? This is going to be a very quick description of three patterns that are important for you to be aware of. I'm not going to go into great detail about them. But when we see a child who has erratic, highly unpredictable care, maybe it's a parent whose life is kind of full of chaos. Maybe it's a parent who's just so stressed about what's happening in her life that even though he or she can provide sensitive care, it's hard to sustain it in the way children need. It doesn't matter so much what the reasons are, because babies don't know reasons. They know what they experience. And with highly erratic, unpredictable care, not just the little ups and downs that we all inflict on our children, but really unpredictable, the child develops this heightened arousal, heightened anxiety, and kind of a hypervigilance. Ooh, is mom going to be there if I leave? And so they can't really begin to do that exploration and moving away. And as we follow these kids long term, they are being identified in great numbers as having significant anxiety problems, although anxiety disorders can happen for a variety of reasons. There's a strong hereditary component as well. So don't look at a child or an adult with anxiety and say, oh boy, bad attachment. People have done that, you know. But if a child has that erratic care, that greatly increases the risk that they will develop an anxiety disorder, or at least that they will be viewed by teachers and others as being highly dependent, not able to develop the core kinds of self-sufficiency skills that we need to be able to navigate our lives. So that's the primary connection. These kids are like often making choices that keep them in a perpetual state of crisis, or they're framing things as a crisis. It's as if, you know, if I only scream loud enough and long enough and hard enough, maybe I'll get a response. So their attachment behaviors, that help-seeking, comfort-seeking, is heightened because of this abiding anxiety. Totally different pattern, the little boy with the angry face below, that's a stock photo. I don't know what his attachment quality really was, but seemed like a good image for this. If a parent is chronically unresponsive, Maybe it's a parent who buys wholeheartedly into the spoiling myth. Huh, I don't want my kid to grow up to be a wimp. I'm not going to run to him every time he cries. He has to learn how to be on his own. 3 months? 6 months? So with chronic unresponsiveness, maybe it's a parent who has severe depression, just doesn't have the emotional energy to be able to respond. Babies don't know reasons. But that chronic unresponsiveness gradually leads the baby to adapt to that condition. And that is, I'm going to look like I don't need anything. Because maybe if I don't look needy, maybe I'll bump up against my parents and get a little bit of what I need. So by the time we assess quality of attachment when the child is a year old, we leave them in a room with a stranger. Their mom goes out of the room for a while. It's an unfamiliar environment. And then the mom comes back afterwards. The child who's had this chronic unresponsiveness looks like, I don't care if my mom goes out. You know, doesn't look ruffled at all. But we measure heart rate. Heart rate goes up. Take a sample of saliva, check the cortisol. Cortisol goes up a little bit. This child is experiencing separation anxiety as children do. That's normal, even positive phenomenon. It's part of the system. But that child has learned already not to show it behaviorally. And when the parent comes back after the separation, the child will often, instead of looking relieved or happy or seeking comfort, the child will turn away, move away. So anxious avoidant attachment is how we describe it. And long-term, these kids are very much at risk of being aggressive, non-compliant, show a striking lack of empathy. They've not really experienced it. And they often become very good at behaving in ways that make people want to go the other way. So it's easy for these kids, through their behavior, which is an understandable adaptation to their attachment, to replicate what they've experienced by behaving in ways that just make people say, as one teacher in our longitudinal study said, I hate to admit it, but I'm really relieved when he's absent. I remember having that feeling toward a child when I was a young elementary school teacher back in 1967. I hated that feeling. I thought I was going to love every child and, save the world. And when I had that feeling of just being relieved when that child didn't come to school, I wouldn't be surprised if it was a child like the little boy in this picture. One last pattern, and I really shouldn't even call it a pattern because it's separate from the usual 3-pattern way that attachment has been assessed. But what we've discovered over the last couple of decades is that some parents are both frightened and frightening with their child. Very often it's a parent who's a victim of domestic abuse, maybe has been a longtime victim of abuse in childhood, and that parent is comfortable in the victim role, has been there a lot, but with this little baby, the parent has some power, some size, and ends up behaving in ways that are frightening to that child. Might not even be overt abuse, but it often is. But sometimes it's just grabbing the child a little too hard or getting into the child's face and kind of, looming in the child's face, becoming so intense that the child is just kind of backing away in fear. These children don't even really settle into an adaptive pattern. They don't know how to deal with that because the person who's supposed to be their safe haven, their place of refuge, so often is the source of the threat from which they need refuge. So what does a little 1-year-old do? Well, these kids actually dissociate. They just look like they disappear from the situation. And I'm talking about in the assessment, in the reunion of the attachment assessment. So they sometimes will just drop to the ground, or they'll reach out their arms and grimace and pull their head back. So you see that they're just not sure what's going to happen. And they're very much at risk of significant psychopathology as they move toward and through adolescence and early adulthood. So we're really trying to figure out ways to prevent all of these insecure patterns of attachment, but this disorganized pattern seems to have particularly severe consequences, and that's getting a lot of attention in attachment research right now. So the benefits of secure attachment and the harmful effects of insecure attachment are not only psychological, but they're physiological. I touched on that a little bit in my reference about attachment as a buffer. Attachment affects brain chemistry, and it affects architecture of the brain as those neural connections are being built, and as the structures of the brain are being strengthened or weakened from disuse. And so those brain effects, those physiological effects, are being shown to have particularly profound effects on self-regulation, which I mentioned earlier, and also executive function, which is kind of using your thinking brain and to plan and organize and to override your impulses and so on. So that right now is one of the most fruitful areas of attachment research, but with findings that are pretty striking and a little bit frightening in terms of what the long-lasting effects might be. And at what point can we turn this around? How long is the window of opportunity open? I don't believe, and I certainly don't want to believe, that the window of opportunity slams shut when a child is 1 or 1.5. And in fact, there's some encouraging research coming out of Romania where Charles Nelson at Harvard and Charlie Zena from Tulane are studying orphans in Romanian orphanages, and they're being placed in therapeutic foster homes, and they're doing brain imaging to see how their brains actually change, not just their behavior, if they are placed early enough in therapeutic, really carefully supported and trained foster homes. But it really does have to be early. And the research is a little frightening as well as encouraging if we can just garner the will and the resources to act early, preferably to prevent the kinds of extreme difficulties with attachment that some of these patterns reflect, but also how can we intervene early enough and build the supportive relationship-based connections around a child that will allow that child to build new pathways, new circuitry in the brain, and to really build new psychological patterns. So the ingredients of secure attachment, which I touched on at the beginning, predictable sensitive care in particular, sound so simple, don't they? But parents need some things if they're going to be able to provide that. And it doesn't have to be perfect. You know, the reason I call the show that my daughter and I do Mom Enough is because of a concept that comes from attachment theory way back in the 1950s. The good enough parent, the good enough mother. We didn't talk much about fathers back then, but fathers are hugely important too as attachment figures and as other influences in children's development. But we don't have to be perfect, thank God. Impossible anyway. So isn't it great that children can thrive and succeed and be healthy and strong within the parameters of good enough, being mom enough or dad enough? Not mom too little, not dad too much, but enough. What do parents need to be good enough parents? Well, they need fulfillment of their basic needs. If you don't have food, shelter, and safety, how in the world are you going to muster the emotional energy it takes to respond to your child's needs? I had great resources as a young mom, and I still found it to be the hardest job I'd ever taken on, ever. You know, I think most of us who are parents or child care providers, as many of you in this room are, know that. Second thing is knowledge of child development. Our research in the longitudinal study at Minnesota shows that in particular, it's not just that we need to know that 3-month-old babies do this and 8-month-old babies do that. That's helpful. But what we need is an understanding of the developmental meaning of certain key behaviors. So what about separation anxiety? Are we going to say, oh, see, I told you I was going to spoil him. Now I can't even move out of his sight for 30 seconds and he cries. But if we understand that that's the normal milestone, that that baby now has this great attachment with you, and when you move out of sight, boy, does he want you back. So he's going to cry a little bit, and then he's going to wait and see if it works. And so understanding the meaning of those things, he's saying, you are the most important thing in my world right now, and that's as it should be. Similarly, toddler negativism. It's a pain in the butt, you know? You have to set limits and offer choices, and they still throw a tantrum in the middle of Target, and all sorts of things happen with toddlers. But what's a toddler doing when she says no and does the opposite of what you're asking? Yeah, exactly. Showing I'm a separate person. I have a voice of my own, and I'm going to build my independence, my autonomy. So that child is right on track. Yes, we still have to learn how to deal with it, how to contain it, how to keep the child safe, how to give them healthy choices, but understanding rather than falling into this, oh my gosh, I've raised a monster, or he's just like his Uncle George, he's so mean, So understanding. Third, parents need a strong support system for themselves. And this is not just about formal programs, although certainly some kinds of formal programs are really essential, and for some, if not all families. Mental health problems are rampant among parents. Maternal depression is epidemic proportions in our society. Among teen parents, some studies have shown that about 45% of teen parents have significant depression. That's staggering. So we definitely need to attend to those kinds of services and other sorts of community supports, organizational supports. But what carries you through the tough times? Is it programs? Sometimes. I had a good therapist who got me through some really rocky times in my life. But mostly what gets me through are the informal connections. I have a group of women friends. I've been walking around the lake by where I live in Minneapolis for, I guess, about 35 years with the same group of women friends. We've gone through everything life can throw at you. I've gone through 2 major bouts of cancer myself, once in my 30s, once about 6 years ago. And boy, did I count on those friends to carry me through that. And I've counted on a supportive husband. I've counted on a faith community. There have been other supports as well. So when we talk about support, we need to think both formal and informal. And what does that mean? How do we help people who have never learned how to use informal supports? If they're coming with a really troubled attachment history themselves, they might not be so good at building those supportive connections. And most of us, I think all of us, are so much more able to accept support if we feel we have something to give in return. Even the families we see in the greatest need shouldn't be viewed just as needs. They're resources too. Everybody has something to give. My colleague Byron Eglund and I developed one of the early home visiting models, also included a strong group component. It's called STEEP, Steps Toward Effective Enjoyable Parenting. We had a big grant in the mid to late 1980s from the National Institute of Mental Health. And the program is still going on. I just was in Germany the week before last, where they're using the program all across the country with some outstanding results. But we found that trying to help the parents find what they had to give to the other parents in the group was a huge part of the program's success. How do we realize that people need to contribute? And how do we really get past just seeing the problems and seeing the needs instead of seeing what they have to offer? And finally, research on attachment is increasingly showing how important it is for many parents, and I would say this is really good for all parents, I know it's been good for me, to take a reflective look back at how we were treated in our own childhood. Because the research shows that how you care for your child certainly is shaped by how you were cared for. But it's not only, or not even so much, just how you were treated, but it's how you've come to think about it. There's a rich body of research under the umbrella of adult attachment, and it looks at how people create a narrative about the way they were parented and the kinds of relationships and experiences they had. And the parents who are dismissive, who describe awful things that happened to them, but that was then, this is now. Or the parents who just say, oh, I had a perfect childhood. I'm just so lucky that, everything was just fine. Well, that's maybe a little bit idealizing, even if you had good enough parents. but that dismissing of the things that might have been painful that you might be able to learn something from, that predisposes you to form an avoidant attachment with your child. Because just as you're kind of blowing off your own emotional needs that weren't met, you tend to dismiss your child's emotional needs. And the research is really quite remarkable. The hit rate, if you look at a person's response to this adult attachment interview, and then look at how they build an attachment with their child, measure the quality of attachment with their child, even looking over long periods of time or looking concurrently, the studies have been done in lots of different ways. So dismissiveness is one pattern. Another is being preoccupied. Oh my gosh, yeah, my dad was so horrible to me, and then, oh, and I was so miserable all the time. And the person who can't even kind of zero in and give a narrative, they're so caught up in the emotion of what happened 20 years ago, it's like it happened this morning. And they're still reliving that pain. And so they're not able to muster the resources to respond consistently over time. So they're very much at risk of fostering what we call an anxious ambivalent or resistant attachment, the child who's got this heightened anxiety and just can't move away from mom because the parent is providing erratic, unpredictable care. So that's the way it predicts, but the good news is we can't change how somebody was parented, but we can change how they think about it. And a lot of intervention research is looking at how to do that. It is not easy. And a lot of times parents are not, going to the therapist. We're reaching out to them through ordinary family support programs. Maybe we're not therapists, so we're uneasy to even muck around in that stuff. But a lot of research is now showing that that can be done within appropriate bounds with very good reflective supervision or consultation from someone who is a mental health professional, and really gives you a chance to share that process of looking back and moving forward. In the German research on the program Byron Egeland and I developed, they have even measured the state of mind, attachment state of mind of the workers in their program. They have a very high incidence of avoidant attachment in Germany. About half of the parents and mothers and children assessed in German research fall into that avoidant pattern, and they have the dismissive state of mind. That's a whole other conversation about why that might be. But what they're finding is that so many of the people working in the programs also have that dismissive state of mind because it's very common in the culture. And it's not working for them. You can't just say, well, that's their culture, that's fine. No, some culture isn't a sacred cow. It's a reflection of all sorts of, historic events and reasons and traditions. And sometimes it has to be examined. And sometimes it has to be changed. And that's what the Germans using our program are trying to do. And they're trying to help the workers come to a more, what's called secure autonomous state of mind, not just dismissing the things that were painful for them, not dismissing their own emotional needs, because they found that the worker's state of mind predicted with kind of frightening level of success the outcomes of the families in the program. So this has huge implications for how we train, support, work together to try to deal with this more psychological kind of reality that the research would say really needs to be addressed if we want to facilitate major change in how parents are creating an attachment responding to their children. I relate to this very personally because my parents were teenagers when I was born. My dad dropped out of school at the end of the 9th grade. His family was both sides of the family were very, very poor, but my father's family in particular had a lot of abuse, a lot of mental illness in the family. My grandfather and great-grandfather both had bipolar disorder and committed suicide. I could go on. You don't need the litany of all the risk factors that were a part of that family and that touched my life in many ways. Now, I went on and I had a good marriage and had financial resources and a high level of formal education, broke the cycle, didn't get married as a teenager or have children as a teenager, and went on and got college education and more. But When I was home with my young children, there were days when I heard my father's voice coming out of my mouth. There were days when I felt his explosive temper in me, when I could just feel his facial expressions on my face. And I really had to come to grips with that. I really had to look hard at that and recognize when that was starting to happen. And look my kids in the eyes sometimes and say, you didn't deserve that. My daughter was very good at an early age at saying, you sound just like Grandpa Bob. That was okay, because I needed to be called on that. I didn't like it, but I needed it. And I needed to also look at the things that I wanted to carry forward, because my dad, for all of the things that were painful for me, he was committed to my breaking the cycle. He told me when I was 5 years old, I was going to be top of my high school class. He told me that I was going to go on and do great things, and he showed me that he believed that, even though this same man sometimes hurt me deeply. And that's the reality of life. I think anyone in this room could tell some version of that story. And what the research is showing, and this has huge policy implications for how we prepare people for the field, how we define the parameters of family support programs, how we manage to fund the reflective supervision and consultation that has been shown to ensure quality and effectiveness of programs. What really helps is if we can let down a little bit of our guard, not be the people who have it all together, but can be the people who, like those families we serve, are on this road that's really hard sometimes. It's very real. Doesn't mean we have to tell them a whole lot about our stories, but telling just a little bit, maybe just as much as I just told you, can really help people to begin to dare to do that reflective looking back so they can move forward. Remember this corner patches? You cut your paw on a piece of glass. Gee, I forgot all about that. Don't knock a poor memory. It saves you from reliving a lot of pain. That's a really important cartoon, because a lot of people have blocked out a painful past because it just hurts too much to go there. And we need to honor that and name it before we ask people to begin to do otherwise. So that's part of the being real in doing this work. So, how well do current policies and programs support families in building secure attachments? And these questions you can go through on your own. I think I won't even go through them right now. I offer these to you in the handout as questions for reflection, taking what I presented to you about the importance of attachment and asking yourself, how are we doing? How are we doing in our programs? How are the policies at the local, state, federal, county level, whatever your jurisdictions are? How are those policies supporting that the work be done well? I'm going to pause for just one moment and give you a chance to ask one or two questions if you have any. And if you would keep it just to questions for clarification or something that's not going to be a long, knotty, KNOTTY kind of discussion. Anything that you need clarified from that before I move quickly on to the second big area of research? It's a lot lighter. Yes? Sure. And I'm not really focusing on language development here today, and I think that's had lots and lots of coverage and is hugely important. What has not had such good coverage, I think, is the fact that it really does happen best in very close relationships. And certainly a part of the interaction between a sensitive, responsive parent or other caregiver and a child is talking to each other from, first just the little babbles and imitative vocalizations that happen between parent and child, describing what's happening in the environment, singing, doing word games, silly rhymes, making up words, all of those things that are a part of healthy, positive, sensitive, responsive interaction. And most of you probably know the classic Hart and Risley study that showed the huge disparities between families who have better financial resources and those who don't, just in terms of how much children are spoken to in the months and earliest months and years, and I mean even in the months before the child can talk back, and also the kinds of verbal interactions that happen. So that's a whole body of research that we really can't go deeply into today, but I think the important message that I think you're trying to raise is that that happens within relationship. We have people, you know, marketing all kinds of gadgets and promoting, you know, TV shows and video games and things to stimulate language development. Waste of money as far as I'm concerned, because all the research shows that language development happens in face-to-face interaction. And that should really be a part of what we do both at home and also in our early care and education centers. One or two more real quick questions and comments. Yes?
I wonder if you could address the role of outside the home caregivers in the development of attachment, either when there's a good or poor attachment with the parent.
Great question. One of the things that there are a couple of ways to combat that, and one is that other adults in the child's life are in a very powerful position to support the knowledge and understanding of parents so that they can be the primary attachment figures to their child. So, you know, if you're a child care provider or an early childhood educator, you are a trusted person who can just, you know, come side by side with the parent. We're on the same team, and, you know, here's what I'm figuring out I need to be doing, and you know, I bet it would be really fun for your child if you were doing this too. And so support the parents in their role. But the other thing that comes through quite strongly in the research is that for children who do not have the kind of attachment that's optimal, secure attachment at home, if you look at a balance scale of risk factors and protective factors, having a secure attachment with another caregiver, a paid child care provider or another family member or someone else, can be the protective factor that tips the balance in terms of long-term outcomes. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't still going to be something lost in the child's development from not having it at home, because home does have a very powerful effect, but that can be the factor that tips the balance. It requires that there be continuity of care, because it's not just about having good care, but from one person after another. We're talking here about a relationship that's close and enduring. Now, not forever necessarily like the parent-child relationship is, but if we're having kids move from one caregiving context to another at critical junctures in their infant development, you know, lots of kids who have a good secure attachment at home, they might have a little trouble with it for a while, but no big deal in the long run. But for a child who doesn't have the secure attachment they need, that's going to be much more difficult. Yes, last question, and then I want to make sure I cover this other topic.
What did you say STEEP stands for?
Steps toward effective, enjoyable parenting, and I'd be glad to connect you to some resources on it if you're interested. Okay, well, let's talk about the second big area, and I'm going to do this quickly and then kind of circle back to parent-child relationships in my closing. But one of the things that is really coming through so strongly in the research today is the importance of play in children's lives. You know, many of you are early childhood educators, and so you know this inside out. But the sad thing is, a lot of people don't. And so I want to talk about what's happening with that. The amount of time children of all ages spend playing, particularly in ways that are not directed by an adult. I'm not talking, structured games have their place. That's a good kind of playing in some ways, but what's really missing from children's lives is the play that is less structured, that involves free exploration and kids structuring their own time. What do I mean by play? Trying on grown-up roles, acting out your fantasies. Everybody in our family wants to be a musician, so those are my 4 grandchildren at different stages of development. What do we mean by play? Explore, follow your own curiosity, and discover things. Get active, get sweaty, get dirty, get wet, get silly, have fun. These are the things that are missing from so many children's lives. Why is that so? Well, we've had a huge increase in organized adult-directed activities. Some of this is driven by competition, by an idea that it's only in adult-directed organized activities that children are going to build their resumes. Sometimes it's driven by a sense of danger. So we see a lot of parents who are so worried about stranger danger or about kids getting hurt that they don't let children roam freely. My kids are 41 and 38, and they are literally of the last cohort of kids who were free-range children. And this is documented. It's the kids just right after them, and so the parents now who are in their early 30s and younger who did not themselves grow up running around and playing freely, and certainly did not play outside. My friend Richard Louv wrote a wonderful book, came out in 2005, Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. I worked with him and 3 other colleagues to develop the Children in Nature Network, which is now an international movement really to try to help people figure out how to get kids back outside, off the couch, away from the screens and so on, for all kinds of reasons, and I'll touch on those briefly. An increase in screen time for kids of all ages. This sucks up so much time. Kids of all ages for adults of all ages. Spillover of adult work. Some of the research is showing that now, much thanks to technology, work has no boundaries for many people. So many adults are wanting more quiet time at home, and that affects what they want or will allow their children to do. And very relevant to our policy focus today, an emphasis on academic learning narrowly defined at earlier and earlier ages. This is why I use that title, Keeping the Child in Early Childhood Education, because we are very misguided, as important as literacy and numeracy and those things are, we are very misguided if we think that means seat work and worksheets for little toddlers. You know, we have really missed the boat on that, and it comes from good intentions, emphasizing how we have to reduce the achievement gap by starting very early, but that doesn't mean doing 5th grade when kids are 3. Popular views of free time and play are that play is wasting time. We have to change that. We are the voices for children. Children need play. Why? Research shows that it fosters and supports their development of autonomy and initiative, coming up with the ideas, acting on them independently. Creativity. What employer in any kind of profession other than ditch digging, and maybe even in ditch digging, doesn't want somebody who's creative and a good problem solver? Social skills, positive connections with peers. A lot's been written on this. I'm just hitting the highlights here. Language development, rich language development when kids do creative play. I found a note the other day that my oldest grandchild wrote. She's not a preschooler anymore, but she's been doing this since she was. She had created a very intense drama with her brother. It went on for like 2 hours, I think. They're doing this just rich play scenario, and it was something about the workplace, and I found after she left a note. Well, McKinley, that's her brother's name, congratulations, you got the job. Surprise, now I own you. And then she went on and said what he was going to have to do, everything she told him. I laughed so hard, but I thought, oh, that's great. I mean, think about, what she's learning from that and what he's learning from that. That's kind of a silly example, but all sorts of things that come from play. Mastery of fears and concerns. Kids act out the things that frighten them. That's just rich. Just rich. Cognitive development, concept development, executive function, planning the play themselves rather than having an adult plan it. And self-regulation, all the self-control and impulse control that it takes to be able to sustain play that you're in charge of. Specific benefits of outdoor play, and this is being studied more and more: better physical health, less stress and anxiety, better concentration and academic performance after being outdoors, and the increased likelihood of being good stewards of the environment. So many reasons. How do we get that message out? How do we let people know how important play is? Again, I'm going to leave these questions for you to reflect on, thinking about how our policies and programs really take this into account, both of these rich bodies of research. But these two areas of research together challenge us to remember the importance of social-emotional development as the underpinning of all domains of young children's learning. To recognize that free play and exploration add great value to children's learning above and beyond the more academic activities. And finally, to embrace and honor in all of our policy efforts that parents are first and foremost in their children's lives, and to do all we can to support parents in building on their strengths, addressing their challenges, so they can provide the care and protection their children need and deserve. If you will bear with me for 1.5 more minutes, I want to just close with a reflection that's inspired by a young mom who was in the STEEP program back in the 1980s when Byron Eglin and I first developed it. And like all the moms in that program, all the parents in that program, she had a lot of risk factors. She had had very poor parenting as a child, abuse, neglect. She didn't have good resources at all at the time she became a mother. And she said to her STEEP worker, as she looked into the face of her little baby boy who was just a day or two old, she said, "I know nothing about babies. I know nothing about what it means to be a parent. And I have nothing that I can think of in my own childhood that would give me an example of what to do. All I can do is look into this little boy's eyes and say, here I am, here I am." And I thought, well, that's a good place to start. She inspired me to write a song, and I'm not going to sing it for you. I won't inflict that on you today, although I do sing. But I just want to close by reading the words of this song. It's not long. And I want you to just picture all the parents out there who might say similar things. One small voice calls out to me, crying for comfort and care. Two tiny arms reach out, saying, I need your love. One trusting heart looking to me for all that he needs. But all that I can say is, here I am, here I am. Two shining eyes gaze into mine, watching to see how to live life. One hungry mind reaches out to know all there is to know. One beautiful child striving to be all she can be. But all that I can say is, here I am, here I am. One precious life placed in my hands to cherish and hold. One life to nurture and love with all that is mine to give. One golden chance given so we can be all we can be. And all that I can say is, here I am, here I am. In our words and actions, in practice, in policy, we need to say to each parent and each child in our communities, here I am, here I am. Thank you very much.